The Masquerade Ball at the ancient Greystone Manor was the social event of the year. The mansion itself stood atop a windswept hill, its towering spires and ornate gargoyles looming against the pale moonlight. Inside, gilded chandeliers cast a warm glow over the marble floors, and the guests, draped in sumptuous fabrics and wearing elaborate masks, mingled like exotic birds of paradise. Music from a string quartet swirled through the air, punctuated by the occasional ring of laughter and clinking glasses. Arthur, the host of the ball and owner of the manor, stood near the grand staircase, resplendent in his crimson velvet coat and black silk mask adorned with intricate golden patterns. He surveyed the crowd, his discerning gaze sweeping across familiar and unfamiliar faces alike. He was a renowned socialite and collector of rare artifacts, often boasting of his knowledge in art and antiquities. Among the throngs of guests was Evelyn, a journalist with a keen interest in unraveling mysteries. She wore a simple yet elegant mask, stark white with delicate lace trimming. Her eyes scanned the crowd with practiced precision, noting every eccentric character and detail for her feature article. Rumors of Arthur's notorious collection of macabre and mystical objects had piqued her curiosity. The evening wore on, and the guests were well into their drinks when a curious murmur began to ripple through the hall. In a dimly lit corner, resting upon a pedestal, was an object that no one seemed to recognize or recall seeing earlier. A mask. Unlike the elaborate, colorful pieces worn by the guests, this one was unnervingly plain. A polished white porcelain face devoid of expression. Its empty, dark eye sockets stared out into the room like two deep abysses. Arthur, noticing the gathering of guests around the mask, made his way through the crowd. As he approached the pedestal, a faint smile crossed his lips, for the mask was one he had procured from a recent estate sale. He addressed the onlookers with a flourish of his hand. "Behold, ladies and gentlemen, an artifact from the Orient. A relic said to be imbued with mystical properties, or so the legends go." He spoke of an ancient ritual, cryptically hinting that the mask had been worn by a shaman who could glimpse the future. Arthur's tale was both captivating and unsettling, and as he recounted its history, several guests leaned in closer to inspect the mask, entranced by its featureless gaze. Evelyn, skeptical of Arthur's penchant for drama, remained on the fringes of the group, her journalist instincts kicking in as she observed the reactions of the others. One guest, an elderly gentleman with a peacock-feathered mask, leaned in so close that his breath fogged the porcelain surface. He locked eyes with the mask for a long, uncomfortable moment. Suddenly, he clutched his chest and staggered backward. No, it can't be," he muttered, his voice cracking. He slumped to the floor, unconscious. Chaos ensued as guests rushed to his side, and Arthur, concerned yet maintaining his composure, summoned his staff to carry the man away. "Let us not overreact, my friends," he implored. The gentleman merely had too much wine. The incident cast a shadow over the ball, and the guests gradually resumed their mingling, albeit with a more subdued air. The porcelain mask, now viewed with suspicion, was left undisturbed on its pedestal. But Evelyn couldn't ignore the slight tremor in Arthur's voice as he tried to calm the crowd. Her eyes remained fixed on the mask, now seemingly darker under the dimming chandelier light. It was then that Evelyn noticed the mask had shifted. Not much, just slightly, but enough for her to question if it had truly been moved by another guest, or if it had somehow done so on its own. The thought made her uneasy. She scanned the hall, noting guests glancing warily toward the porcelain mask, its cold gaze seemingly following them. Some nervously chuckled it off, while others avoided looking in that direction altogether. By the end of the evening, as Arthur bid his remaining guests farewell, Evelyn took one last glance at the empty-eyed mask. An inexplicable chill ran down her spine as she turned to leave the mansion, the mask's hollow gaze lingering in her mind. That night, as the guests of the masquerade drifted into restless slumber, their dreams grew increasingly dark. The empty sockets of the porcelain mask seemed to watch from the shadows, whispering secrets they had long buried deep within their own minds. In the darkness, Nightmares began to weave themselves into their dreams as the porcelain mask patiently waited for its next victim. The morning after the masquerade ball dawned overcast and gray. At Greystone Manor, Arthur was nursing a stiff drink as he sat in his study, reflecting on the previous night's events. The eerie porcelain mask was now locked away in a glass display case, hidden among the curiosities in his collection room. Although he had dismissed the incident with the elderly guest as an overindulgence of wine, he couldn't shake a lingering unease. He resolved to learn more about the mask's origins. Meanwhile, Evelyn paced her modest apartment, scribbling notes in her journal as she replayed the strange events of the evening. She couldn't ignore the growing dread that had settled in her chest, or the peculiar way the mask's empty gaze seemed to penetrate her own. Curious but rational, she resolved to investigate further and uncover the mystery behind the enigmatic porcelain face. That afternoon, the first reports of nightmares began trickling in from the ball's attendees. Gossip spread among the elite circles about unnervingly vivid dreams where they were pursued by shadowy figures, trapped in rooms without doors, or faced their worst fears. The elderly guest who had fainted was now bedridden, muttering incoherent words about an unending maze and a whispering mask. Arthur's attempts to reassure other guests were met with skepticism, and they began questioning whether something more sinister had taken root. Evelyn took the opportunity to interview some of the guests, discovering that each of their nightmares seemed disturbingly personal, preying on phobias and insecurities they had thought long buried. A businessman who dreaded public failure dreamed of being humiliated on stage. A socialite who feared aging saw herself withered and frail, unable to recognize her own reflection. Even those who had merely glanced at the mask during the ball reported feeling uneasy, as if an unseen force were watching them. By dusk, a paranoia had settled over the city's socialites. Doors were bolted, windows sealed, and some took to burning incense to ward off evil spirits. Evelyn herself found sleep elusive, her mind replaying the image of the mask's hollow sockets until it seemed to bleed into the shadows of her room. When she finally drifted into slumber, she dreamed she was back at Greystone Manor. She wandered its labyrinthine halls alone, her footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. The rooms were all empty, save for a faint whispering that grew louder with each step. She turned a corner and found herself in the ballroom. But now it was dark, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. In the middle of the room, perched on the pedestal, was the porcelain mask. Its empty eyes seemed to fix directly on Evelyn as she approached, compelled by an invisible force. The whispering became deafening, a chorus of voices murmuring in languages she couldn't comprehend. Her heart pounded as she found herself drawn closer, her eyes locking onto the mask's lifeless gaze. Suddenly, she was falling, tumbling down a dark void, surrounded by swirling fragments of shattered porcelain. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, and she could hear her own voice among them, calling out for help. But no one answered. She was alone in the abyss. She jolted awake, gasping for breath, her sheets soaked with sweat. The mask's hollow eyes lingered in her mind, and she could still hear the whispers echoing in the darkness of her apartment. Trembling, she flicked on the bedside lamp and made herself a cup of tea, her hands shaking as she tried to steady her nerves. In the days that followed, the nightmares continued to plague the guests of the masquerade. More guests became bedridden, their eyes sunken and faces pale as they spoke in hushed tones of faceless apparitions and winding corridors. Arthur found himself increasingly paranoid, checking the locks on his display case repeatedly and ensuring no one could access the mask, but no amount of caution could protect him from his own dreams. He was pursued by an invisible specter, a shadow that whispered his own fears back to him, promising that it would soon find him in the waking world. Evelyn, desperate to uncover the truth, combed through libraries and historical archives, finding fragmented references to masks used in ancient rituals. Their powers varied: protection, prophecy, or madness. And the stories surrounding them blurred myth and reality. Each seemed to share a common thread: an uncanny ability to reveal the darkest fears of those who encountered them. Arthur, plagued by the same restless nightmares as the guests he had tried to comfort, reached out to Evelyn. They met in the library of Greystone Manor, the dim glow of candlelight flickering across the rows of books. He confessed his own fears, admitting that he had underestimated the mask's power. Together, they resolved to discover the origins of the Porcelain Mask and find a way to break its spell before it consumed them all. Arthur and Evelyn knew their time was limited. The Porcelain Mask had taken root in their minds, weaving threads of darkness through their dreams each night. They delved deeper into the history of the mask, piecing together fragments from occult texts, estate records, and old journals. The mask had been crafted centuries ago by a reclusive cult in the Far East. Intended to embody the fear of the unknown, it was said to be a conduit to a realm of nightmares, a twisted mirror of its wearer's psyche. Legends told of a shaman who used it to foresee impending disasters. But each vision came at a cost: madness and death. Their research led them to a troubling realization. The mask was meant to be destroyed, and any attempt to harness its power was doomed to unleash the very nightmares it was created to reveal. The last known owner had hidden it away in a locked chest, the key long since lost to history. But Arthur had unknowingly broken the seal when he acquired the mask, triggering the curse that now gripped the Masquerade guests. In the dim glow of the moonlit night, they stood before the glass case where the porcelain mask lay encased. The room was filled with an unsettling silence, as if the house itself held its breath. Evelyn stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked, glancing over at Arthur, whose face was drawn and pale. He hesitated, then nodded resolutely. "We can't let this thing destroy anyone else." Together, they unlocked the case and removed the mask, its smooth surface glinting in the moonlight. Arthur held it gingerly, as if it might shatter in his hands. For a moment, they both stood frozen, staring into its empty sockets. Then, as if possessed by a force beyond their control, Arthur slipped the mask over his face. A violent shudder rippled through his body, and his knees buckled. Evelyn reached out to steady him, but she felt herself being pulled into the abyss as well. The room around them melted into darkness, and they found themselves inside a twisted version of Greystone Manor. The walls warped and covered in a thick, dripping ichor. The corridors stretched endlessly in every direction, and the air was thick with whispers, growing louder with each step. Evelyn clutched Arthur's arm, guiding him through the maze. The mask clung tightly to his face, and he struggled to keep moving, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. From the shadows, a shape emerged. It was their fears incarnate, a grotesque figure cloaked in darkness. It slithered toward them, its voice a cacophony of all the nightmares that had haunted them over the past weeks. The mask had laid bare their deepest insecurities, and the creature was determined to feast on their terror. Arthur collapsed to his knees, paralyzed by the sight of the beast. "I can't," he whispered, the mask distorting his voice. "It's too strong." Evelyn crouched beside him, her grip tightening around his shoulders. "Listen to me, Arthur. This isn't real. None of it is real. We can break free." But he could barely hear her through the fog of fear. The creature inched closer, its breath hot and putrid. Evelyn tore the mask from Arthur's face and threw it to the ground. The porcelain shattered into 1,000 shards, and the room erupted in a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, Arthur and Evelyn found themselves back in the display room of Greystone Manor, gasping for breath. The mask lay in pieces at their feet, and a chill breeze swept through the room, as if the house itself was exhaling a long-held breath. The nightmares had lifted, and by morning, the Masquerade guests reported peaceful sleep for the first time in weeks. The Porcelain Mask had lost its grip on their minds, but its legacy lingered. Some guests remained deeply scarred by the horrors they'd witnessed in their dreams, and Arthur could no longer deny the consequences of his obsession. Evelyn, exhausted but resolute, vowed to ensure that no other cursed masks would wreak such havoc. She scoured the archives, identifying other objects of a similar nature, and became a fierce advocate for their destruction. Arthur, shaken by the ordeal, withdrew from the public eye, devoting his remaining days to funding Evelyn's mission and ensuring the mask's shards were scattered across the ocean, never to be assembled again. In the depths of the sea, the porcelain shards glistened like lost stars, waiting patiently for someone foolish enough to piece them back together.